Can Israel be both Jewish and democratic? Are democratic principles and Jewish principles mutually exclusive? This is one of the central questions that we're facing in the rebirth of the State of Israel. And it's one of the most central questions facing both Israelis' attitude towards Israel and feelings about the Jewish state, as well as the possibility of creating a relationship in a new covenant between Israel and world Jewry. Since its inception, Israel has seen itself and defined itself in terms of being both a Jewish and democratic state. These are the principles which are underlying the Declaration of Independence, and this ultimately gets formally placed into Israeli law with the Basic Law of 1992. To ask whether Jewish and democratic could actually coexist, however, requires of us first and foremost to have an understanding of what does the Jewish mean. Maybe we understand what's democratic, and we're going to deal with that later. But what do we mean by Jewish? What defines the Jewishness of the Jewish state? What I'm going to argue for is that the primary definition of the Jewishness of Israel is not a religious category, but it's the national dimension of Jewishness. When we speak about Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, we don't mean the Jewish religion and democracy. We mean the Jewish national identity and democracy. Now, religion is going to have a place in here, as we're going to see. But the core essence of this is that this is the homeland of the Jewish people. That's what we mean by Jewishness. There are four key features which define the Jewishness of Israel. Ones which I believe can fully coexist with the principles of democracy. And those four principles are, first, that Israel's Jewish because there is a Jewish majority. Two, Israel's Jewish because that majority is allowed to and in fact legislates the preservation of its status as a majority. Three, that the state of Israel is Jewish because it sees itself as responsible for Jewish people around the world. And fourth, and this is one of the more complicated aspects, is that Jewish values and Jewish culture are an integral part of the public sphere of this country and of the public policies of this country. Let's take each one separately. The first point is simply an empirical one. Israel is a Jewish state because here there is a majority of Jews defining the national identity of this country. When you look at the inhabitants and the population of the state of Israel, the majority of people who populate this country are Jews, and in that sense, this is a Jewish country. It's Jewish because this is the identity of the nation who lives here. This is their self-perception. This is how we see ourselves. This has nothing to do with our religion. This has nothing to do with our faith. This is Jewishness as a nation, Jewishness as a people. Here in this space, in this location, there resides a people with a particular national identity. That's point number one. Point number two takes this notion and moves it from descriptive to prescriptive. As a majority, as that which constitutes the national identity of this particular location, the Jewish people also have a right to ensure that this remains the homeland of the Jewish people. But by remaining the homeland of the Jewish people, I'm not referring to some foreign policy or some military move or some military strategy. The core feature of the Jewishness of the state of Israel as the national homeland of the Jewish people is that we have a right to ensure that we preserve that majority. And the way that that majority is preserved is through the law of return, which we saw here. What does the law of return state? The law of return gives preferential immigration status to any Jew who wants to belong here. The law of return states that this country is bound to the Jewish people, to the Jewish nation who live all over the world. This is what it means, the Jewishness of this country. It's not an Israeli country. There is a Jewish people who live all over the world, and any of them, if they want to, have a right to move here. That connection, that sense of a bond, and even deeper, that right and an attempt to ensure that we remain a majority is the second feature of what constitutes the Jewishness of the State of Israel. But here it's very important to look at the legislation. The legislation doesn't accept a religious notion of Jewishness for the Jewish state. A religious notion of Jewishness would say if you're born to a Jewish mother, or if you convert to Judaism, according to a particular denomination that you happen to agree with. That was the classical notion of Jewishness, until it was changed to add patrilineal descent by the Reform movement in the United States. But when the law of return was created, we chose a very different definition. According to the law of return, if you have a Jewish mother or a Jewish father, or you're married to a Jew, or you were converted to Judaism, I don't care how, regardless of the denomination, or if you have one Jewish grandparent, that's what makes you Jewish from the perspective of the State of Israel. That's not a religious definition. That's a national definition of Jewishness, which when the framers of this country thought about it, they said, who is a member of my people? How do I know who's a member? We know that we disagree about Judaism as a religion. But we know that the world has a very clear notion of who's a member of this nation. Let's take their definition. Anyone whom Hitler would have killed for being a Jew is accepted as a citizen in the State of Israel. Now, this is not some superficial notion removing religion from the conversation. This is a sense of, this is my nation. If you are a part of this nation, if others see you as part of this nation, even if paradoxically, religiously, I don't see you as part of this nation, from the perspective of the State of Israel, you are a Jew. Now this creates numerous challenges in the State of Israel, for this legislation allows you to acquire citizenship, but afterwards when you leave Ben Gurion Airport and you move into the country, then we have a rabbinate which defines Jewishness from a halachic, from a legal, religious perspective, even though citizenship in the State of Israel is a national one. And it's for that reason that, as you saw in the law of return, it states that you are Jewish so long as you don't belong to another religion. Now, that's not Jewish law. As we saw in prior sessions, in prior units, you could convert out of Judaism and you're still part of this people. The citizenship law, the law of return of Israel, explicitly rejects the Jewish notion, the religious Jewish notion of identity, for the more expansive, broader national one, which states that this is, you are choosing to be a part of this nation. Others see you as part of this nation. You're functioning de facto as a member of this nation. That's so long as you're not functioning as a member of another nation as well. You can't have that dual citizenship in that concept. The fact that there's a Jewish majority here is what makes this a Jewish country. The fact that that majority works to preserve its status as the homeland of the Jewish people, to ensure that we remain a majority, is the second feature. The third feature also grows very deeply out of the national identity of this country, out of Jewishness as a national framework. And that is that the State of Israel is Jewish because it sees itself as responsible for Jews around the world. It doesn't believe that its responsibility is only to Israelis, Jews and non-Jews alike. Any member of the Jewish nation around the world, if you're in danger, then Israel feels responsible. As we saw when you read in a number of sessions ago the speech of the chief of staff of the Israeli army at Auschwitz, Israel, the Israeli defense forces, is really the Jewish defense forces. If you're in need, this is the place where you get to go. Both our military sees itself as such, and the law of return basically is a law which says if you have to leave somewhere, this is the place that has to take you. A country which sees itself as responsible to the Jewish people. And when it sees itself as responsible to the Jewish people, we're not checking your conversion. Nobody checked conversions of the people on Entebbe. 1 second, who do we save and who don't we save? Nobody checks the conversions or even the personal status of Soviet Jewry, nor Ethiopian Jewry. If you see yourself as a Jew, if that's the nation to which you belong, Israel as a state sees itself as bound to you and as responsible for you. These three principles clearly can coexist with democracy. It's Jewish people in this sense as parallel to Irish, English, Canadian, French, Greek. Israel is a nation state. And this is the nation state of a particular nation. And one of the things we have to be very careful about is that very often, in particular those who want to undermine the status of Israel, attack Israel as an anti-democratic state precisely because of its Jewishness, but define Judaism as a religion and not as a nation. But in each one of these understandings, in each one of these points, it's the Jewish national identity of Judaism, not its religious identity, which is at the core of why the state of Israel is Jewish. They're defining Israel as Jewish in terms which have nothing to do with how we're defining Israel. Very often precisely in order to undermine our claim to being democratic. Democracy is a system of government. It's a system of government in which the majority rule, so long as you preserve the essential rights of the minorities. Democracy as a system of government of majority is fully consistent with Jewishness in its national sense. Actually, it's precisely by claiming that we are a Jewish state only because we're a majority here, which reflects the democratic principles of this country. By being a majority, we lay the first foundation of the Jewishness of this country. By being loyal to the Jewish people worldwide, we're simply giving expression to our national identity and to our desire to maintain our status as a majority. These three principles clearly coexist with democracy. But it's at the fourth where the issue becomes more complicated. The fourth point is that Jewish culture, values, principles, calendar are an integral part of the public sphere of this country. Now here we're talking about Judaism as a religion. For as a religion, it is our values, our ideas, our ideals, which are central. Now, what do I mean in this fourth principle? And can this principle coexist with democracy? Let's first clarify the point. A majority in a democracy gets to determine the public sphere, the culture of that country. It gets to bring its ideals, its values, its principles into the public domain. It allows its values, its culture, to be the bond which defines the shared public sphere, the shared public space of this sovereign entity. As the majority, our culture is a Jewish one. This is the place where the Jewish calendar determines the public sphere. When we had to think about our day of rest, we didn't choose and say, okay, maybe it should be Sunday. And it's not by accident that in countries where there is a clear Christian majority, that very often Sunday is the day which is picked. And in countries where there is a clear Muslim majority, it is Friday which is picked as the day of rest. As the culture of the majority, it's our calendar which shapes the national calendar. Whether it is the day of rest on Saturday, whether it is the great Jewish holidays of Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Pesach, Shavuot, Sukkot, Purim, Hanukkah. Israel is a Jewish country first and foremost because the Jewish calendar is the national calendar. And the country functions and sings the song of the rhythm of this calendar. Every Friday, as the industry of flower sales in the streets sprouts up as people bring flowers home to adorn their Shabbat table. This is our calendar. These are our culture, the Hebrew language, Hebrew songs, Hebrew memories, and most significantly, Jewish values. Jewish values enter into the public sphere. The meaning of a Jewish state is where what we think about, what we prioritize as Jews, gets to be expressed. One of the more profound expressions of this, one of the more moving and meaningful ones, we find in the Khan Commission in the text that you studied. When Israel was debating to what extent we were responsible for the Phalanges massacre of Palestinians in Sabra and Shatila, we knew Israeli soldiers didn't do it. We knew that that the Christian Phalanges functioned under an umbrella, which was the IDF. And the question was whether we knew and whether we were responsible for their actions. When the Khan Commission had to issue its findings which, by the way, removed the Chief of Staff and forbade from Ariel Sharon from ever being a Minister of Defense again in the State of Israel. It found both of them guilty, but it said, I'm not finding you guilty under international law. International law is very complicated on this question. I'm finding you guilty because Jewish law, Jewish values, Jewish principles find you guilty. It's Jewish principles which have a notion that you are responsible even if it is only indirectly for allowing something to happen. Even if you didn't do it, if you should have known, if you should have prevented it, you are responsible. And the Khan Commission quotes Deuteronomy, quotes the laws of Eglah Rufa. The Khan Commission also quotes Jewish history. And it says, we Jews, we know what it's like in pogrom after pogrom, when nation states and their government said, it wasn't us, it was the mob. And we turned to them and said, if it's happening under your watch, you're responsible. And they said it wasn't us, relying on the technicality that their army and official police force did not kill the Jews. And the Khan Commission quotes us and says, we know what it's like. And in so doing is quoting the verse that we've quoted over and again this year. You have to love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You have to learn from your history on how you're going to be treating others. This is a Jewish state because the Khan Commission feels that it could reach back to our values to influence public policy, to influence the public sphere. Now here the issue of religion and democracy gets most complicated. Because the religion, the culture, the values of our people grow out of the Jewish tradition. If Judaism is going to be democratic, it's critical that the state of Israel define more carefully what it means by Jewish values and Jewish culture and how it uses them. Judaism must be that which the country uses. It's their resource. But because this country reflects back and uses Judaism as a values and cultural resource, because that's the only one we have, it is critical that this country never adopt one single reading of our tradition as most authentic. This point is very, very important. I want to elaborate on it for a moment. The country has to advocate for Judaism. It cannot, however, embody one particular interpretation of Judaism. The Jewish people don't agree on how we're supposed to live our Jewish lives. We have a shared culture. We have a common calendar. But how you live that calendar, what Shabbat means, that is not agreed upon. Jewish values are that which we share in common. Jewish law is not something that we share in common. A Jewish state doesn't have to be a value-neutral public sphere. Quite to the contrary, it can't be. The culture of this majority is Judaism. As long as the Jewish religion that we integrate into this country is one that takes into account the multiple understandings of what it means to be a Jew, as long as the minority within this country is never coerced to live in accordance with Jewish law, and then this country could still be democratic. And that's in fact what takes place. The first three features clearly coexist with democracy. The fourth can, so long as we simply recognize that Israel could only be as Jewish as democracy allows and not as democratic as Judaism allows. As long as we recognize that, as long as we allow the religion, or rather the culture and values of the majority, to shape the public sphere in a way that's still sensitive to the rights of the minority, then Israel can maintain its aspiration to be both a Jewish and democratic state. Israel defines itself as both a Jewish and democratic state, and aspires to fulfill both principles in its self-definition, self-understanding, and political life. The question is whether the two are in fact possible, whether the two can coexist. Is there an inherent contradiction between the notion of a Jewish state and a democratic state?
No, why should there be? I mean, the Jewish state is a democratic state for the Jewish people. You know, there are indisputably two peoples in this country, and one of them is Jewish. The other is Palestinian Arab. And so if you believe in the right of peoples to self-determination, to national self-determination, which is a universally acknowledged democratic principle, I would say a progressive democratic principle, then naturally what you say is that when in a country where there are two peoples with different national and political aspirations, they both should have a right to a state of their own.
So that the Jewish democratic state, you use the term, is the democratic state
for the Jewish
people. Yeah. Now, the Jewishness of Israel defines the national identity of the majority of the state of Israel,
not the majority people of the state of Israel.
Not the culture of the country.
Well, the culture of any country is, of course, influenced by the national culture of the majority people. When there is a majority people and a minority, in any country where there is a national minority, that is to say, a large group of citizens whose national minority is different from that of the majority people, then of course the culture of the majority people will influence, I would say, the public sphere. But of course the minority has its own rights, not just personal rights, but also cultural rights. By the way, in Israel we respect in many ways the collective cultural rights of the Arab minority are respected in a very significant way. I want to remind you that Arabic is recognized as the second official language, and that you can speak Arabic in the Knesset, you have Arabic on public signs, on road signs and things like that on stamps and on paper money, and these things are not trivial at all.
Throughout your career, you've been thinking about the nature of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, and actually have worked extensively on trying to ensure that they're both possible. How do you understand the meaning of Jewish in Jewish democratic state?
In my mind, and also in the understanding of the Israeli legislators and the understanding of most of Israeli Jews, the Jewish in the Jewish and democratic state means that Israel is a Jewish nation state, that it is the way in which the Jewish people, or those of the Jewish people who choose to do so in Israel, express their idea, their identity, their links to history, and their self-determination, wishing to live under a sovereign Jewish government. It is not Jewish in the religious sense. Obviously, Jewish religion and Jewish religiosity and the Jewish religious tradition are one of the components of what it means to be a Jewish nation state. It has to do with language, it has to do with the country, it has to do with tradition, it has to do with, obviously, the religious tradition, which even those people who are not religious view as part of the Jewish heritage. So when you say Jewish nation state, Jewish is not the analog to a Christian state or a Muslim state. It is an analog to an Italian state, a Norwegian state, a Polish state, an English state. As Chaim Weizmann once said, I think to Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, or to Lord Balfour, I don't remember, the British Foreign Secretary, we want Palestine, Israel, to be as Jewish as England is English.
As English. But now, it is precisely on this issue of Jewish, even if Israel is as Jewish as England is English, it's precisely because Judaism is that which divides the Jewish people and doesn't unite us anymore that we encounter a problem. English, I could be English in England and still be a Christian English, a Jewish English, a Muslim English. Could I be a Christian Jew? You can't be. Now, here it gets complicated. Could I even be a conservative in reform or reconstructionist Jew? All those, Judaism, it gets us in trouble there.
Well, we shouldn't be prisoners of European, basic Christian or post-Christian terminology. In the Christian view, religion and the secular realm are totally different. And this is a minority opinion in world history. The Greek city-states like Athens and Sparta or Rome, and certainly not in the Islamic world, were not just countries where their religion didn't play a role. In the Athenian democracy, becoming a citizen of Athens, the Athens of Pericles and Socrates, you became a citizen of Athens when you were allowed to worship at the temple of Pallas Athena, the goddess of the city-state of Athens, and so in Rome. So it is only in the Christian view where Jesus is supposed to have said, give to God what's to God and what's to Caesar, that there is this complete dichotomy between the here and now and the religious and moral realms. This is not the case in Judaism. This was not the case in Republican Rome, in Republican Athens, and this is not also the case, of course, in Islam. So we have to understand that the Western terminology, which we as cosmopolitans in a way adopt, is a basically parochial Western Christian or post-Christian view. And there are other alternatives. The issue is the fact that religion may become a part of the identity of a country, is it going to force itself on those citizens who are not members of that religious group? And therefore the democratic in the Jewish and democratic is so important. Israel is a Jewish nation state, and it is a democratic state defending the rights of its minorities. In Israel, you don't have to be Jewish in order to be a citizen. About 20% of Israel's citizens, and I'm not talking about the occupied territories, I'm talking about Israel proper. 20% of Israel's citizens are Arabs, most of whom are Muslims, and some of them are Christians. And they have a right to vote, they have a right to be represented in government, they have the same social and educational rights. I don't want to idealize the situation because of the war situation between Israel and Arab countries. The situation of Arabs in Israel as a minority in the Jewish nation state is complicated, but it is complicated because of the war situation, not because of the conceptual issue that Israel is a Jewish nation state. All our neighboring countries are not exactly democratic, but they view themselves as Arab countries, and this is fine. You are an Egyptian and you are an Arab, you can be Christian, you can be Muslim, that's not the point. I think we should not look at it from the very narrow point of view of, say, the American experience, where there is obvious separation, not of religion and state, but of church and state.
Let's take that for a moment. Okay. And very often, one of the great challenges that Israel faces is that the largest Jewish community outside of Israel lives in North America, lives in the United States and Canada, and there, the United States in particular, there is a clear separation between church and state, very often called a separation of state and religion, which is not the same. But they then turn to Israel, and they're coming with a conception about what democracy requires. And they look at Israel and they say, when you say Jewish, even under your notion that it's a Jewish nation state, and you recognize it as Jewish nation state that involves culture and language and also religion, they're saying that this is a democracy that I don't recognize, and this is a democracy that I can't respect.
Well, in this case, most American tourists would not recognize democracy when they come to England or Italy or Germany or Spain or countries like Norway where they still have a state church.
Tell us, go into that a little more, because it's true. Americans are very, very parochial. Americans play baseball and have a World Series and call it the World Series. So, but here we're facing a real challenge.
Take the mother of democracies, which is Great Britain, England, which is really the model of liberalism, tolerance for minorities, etc. There is no separation of church and state in England. The King or Queen of England is the head of the Church of England. There is a state religion, which is the Church of England. All other religions are tolerated, at least are tolerated since the 19th century. You can be a Muslim, a Jew, a Catholic, a Presbyterian, etc., etc. But they are in a very different situation and status vis-à-vis the Church of England, which is state-funded. The other religions are not state-funded. In Israel, and this may come as a surprise for people outside the country, not only is the chief rabbinate of Israel funded by the government, but the Muslim religious courts and the Muslim religious authorities, the imam and the qadis are funded by Israel, and they have their role in supplying religious services to people who are Muslims, or in that case, in some cases, Christian. So the American case is very important, but it's only one case, and and again, when you look at some of the absurdities in it, in the United States, when somebody is being sworn in as a president, he takes an oath, which has God in the name, and he puts his hand on the Bible. God forbid, nothing like this will ever happen in Israel. All civic and public oaths are civic oaths. The President of Israel, ministers of the government, members of the Knesset take an oath to follow the laws of the country, the law of the land. There is no religious element in it. In the United States, meetings of Congress are opened by prayers. There are pluralistic prayers, not just Protestant prayers. Today, there are also Catholic and Jewish.
So what does separation of church and state mean in the United States?
It means that in the meaning of the founders, if I may be a constitutional lawyer for a moment, it means that not one church has a monopoly on state power, and there is no coercion in religious matters. It's not that if you're not a member of Church 1, you cannot be a citizen of the United States.
So the notion or the aspiration, a Rawlsian value-neutral public sphere, doesn't really exist.
In the United States?
In the United States.
It doesn't. Look, I mean, look at the calendar. I mean, Christmas is not just a festival or a holiday for Christians. Christmas is a public holiday. And if you are a Jew, you have somehow to live with a calendar that accepts the birth of Jesus as a public affair. Banks are closed, offices are closed. The public square from Thanksgiving to Christmas is not neutral in terms of religious symbolism. It doesn't mean that you have to go to church and start singing Christmas carols. And this is a difference.
And that parallel would then be parallel to a Jewish state, where a Jewish state, it's not, there is no church, Jewish church that everybody must belong to, but the public sphere can be defined by Jewish values without it violating the democratic principles.
Precisely, I think on this one we're a little bit better than the United States, because the Israeli law that imposes a day of rest says that the official day, the public day of rest is Saturday and the Jewish holidays. members of the public who are not Jewish can observe as public days of rest their own rest. So if you are a Muslim, you don't have to work. If you're a civil servant, you don't have to work on Friday. If you are a Christian, you don't have to work on Sunday. Now, this is sometimes making life complicated, but it shows that Israeli society is very pluralistic and it is very tolerant of minorities, despite the fact that because there is a Jewish majority in the country and the public symbolism of the country are not neutral. I mean, our flag is a Jewish flag with a shield of David. Our national anthem is Hatikva, which speaks about Jewish yearnings to come back to Zion. Our state emblem is the menorah that was in the Jewish temple. Those things are not neutral, but so is the British flag. If you look at the British flag is made up of 3 crosses. The English cross of St. George, the Scottish cross of St. Andrews, and the Irish cross of St. Patrick. And people are living in England or in Great Britain, and they may be Jews or they may be Muslims, they may be atheists, and they don't feel uncomfortable because of that flag, because nobody is coercing them to religious ceremonies with which they do not agree. The same is the case in Israel.
Now, the United States model would be that we take 2 separate national identities and you convert in many ways, you convert through when you become a citizen to a third or a different national identity. In Israel, we're trying a different model. In Israel, the model of Israel is we have 2, or the Middle East, 2 distinct national identities which don't want to, they don't want to merge together, or we don't want to let them merge together, or is the model different? How is this nation state different than the United States model, and what's implied from that?
In America, which is, by the way, you don't combine 2, you combine dozens. That's one of the reasons, and you don't combine 2 languages, you are basing everything on 1 language, by the way. All the immigrant communities have accepted the American English and other aspects of American culture as their main identity. But the American model, which combines inclusivity and pluralism, and in this way it is very successful, still the main point is that all the ethnic groups in America accept that their overall national identity is the American one and it is common to them. None of them claims the rights of a national minority in the sense of having its, by the way, for example, it's a language accepted as an official language of the state, a second official language of speaking that language in parliament, having it on stamps. These are symbolic things, but what they express is that we are different from you. We're no worse, but we're different from you. We belong to another. And of course, the Jews in Israel see themselves connected with the Jews outside of Israel, and the Arabs in Israel see themselves, important part of their identity, their identity connection with Palestinian Arabs and other Arabs outside of Israel.
So there's no agreement here to reach a shared common national identity?
The 2 national identities, for example, existed when the state emerged. And they not only existed, but they also in conflict. We have to remember that. So I think it would not be a realistic, because some people suggested that, but no attempt to merge the Jews and Arabs into a single a civic identity. Yes, they should have a single civic identity. But
does that reality,
creating a different cultural
does that reality though then create a fundamental challenge to democracy? Is it possible in the United States model, when different citizens or members of different nation states join together, they convert into...
But they immigrate to another country.
They immigrate from it. They convert into this new shared national identity, creates a core equality amongst all the citizens. Here, by definition, because we have majority and minority, because we have 2 distinct national identities which are maintained and sustained, doesn't it create perpetual challenges on the issues of democracy? Is the American model a better model?
First of all, challenges, of course, it creates. A better model, the American model is certainly a better model for America. But there are different conditions, and there is a difference between immigrants from dozens of countries coming to one country, adopting to a very large degree the culture of the original one. By the way, I'm insisting on the language. People take it for granted, but language is not just a technical means of communications. Most theories of modern nationalism will tell you that the language is the main objective cultural characteristic of peoplehood, of nationhood. And so in every European, when we talk about national minorities, this is closer to the European situation than to the American situation.
Explain to me what you mean by that. Here it is. We're looking now at Israel.
Yes.
And one of the critiques or challenges is because, you know what? Adopt here the United States model. Create here a state where every national identity is equal, because just like you have Irish American, Greek American, Jewish American, Hispanic American.
Yeah,
I know you don't, but I accept that.
These are subdivisions within a single nation.
But that's exactly what America does. But
Absolutely.
Israel would be better served by creating a shared national identity where there's subdivisions, where the Jews and the Arabs in the state of Israel will give up
ethnic communities within a single nation.
Within a single national one. Is that not the better democracy? Is that not really what democracy requires?
Democracy is about human beings having a right to have their culture and to be governed by consent. Now, this is what happens in this country. Many bad things are also happening, but people have their culture, and they're governed by a democratically elected government. Now, in Israeli terms, let's see what it would have meant to try to implement the American model. That would have meant in 48, 49, saying, okay, we were established as a Jewish state, but now having been established, let's forget about Jewish peoplehood and Arab peoplehood or national identity, and let's have an all-embracing civic Israeli national identity based on Hebrew, if you want to adopt the American model, based on Hebrew. So we are kind of putting our religion, we are downgrading the importance, I would say, of the Jewish religion in our identity, and you are downgrading the importance of Islam in your identity. Has this been checked, whether this is what Jews and the Arabs want? But okay, let's forget it. And we have a common
forget it, that's the point. Okay,
the
right.
opposite, but let's have and then we have as a common basis of our common national identity, within which there would be ethnic communities, but not different peoples in the same national sense. We would have, of course, the Hebrew language as the American English. Now, that would have been totally unacceptable. Giving the Hebrew language in the state of Israel the status of English in America would have been totally unacceptable to the Arab minority. By the way,
let me take this let's play with this a little more. Would that be the reason then why the United States model is in fact the minority model in democracies around the world? The argument being, if I follow what you're saying, is that the United States model requires of people to be willing to give up their national identity, their prior national identity, for the sake of a new one. And that could mean language, culture, values, etc. And you enter either into a value-neutral public sphere or a public sphere defined by those values which we hold in common, the values which we're separated on, we can't bring into this new national identity, because that would create divisiveness and it would bring your old national identities. The fact that most European states, democracies, chose a different model would be because they weren't willing to give up their national identities.
Yeah, but you see, the difference is that in the American case, these are immigrant communities, all of them. They're all immigrants. There are maybe first immigrants, but all other. Now, Israeli Arabs say, they insist on it. When you hear the rhetoric of the Arab minority in Israel, the first thing they say, we're not immigrants. We are a native, indigenous, national minorities. We are from here. We are not like Irish people and Jewish people and Polish people who came to America and said, okay, you can keep some of your culture. Of course, it's a free country, it's a pluralistic country, but the main thing you have to become an American, and that means English. I mean, people kind of assume that English is something which is not. English in America is the one of the main bases of the common national identity. You don't have, American Jews don't have state schools in which they teach in Hebrew. They don't demand it. Now, in Arabs in Israel, it's not just a matter of speaking Arabic in the Knesset. That's a symbolic thing. But having a whole system of education, of state education in state schools, in which it's not only that you learn Arabic, you study Arabic, but the teaching is in Arabic. That's an important part of their right to preserve their identity. Now, in Europe, the difference between America and Europe is the minorities in Europe. Now they also have immigrants and they have a lot of problems, but the minorities, like, for example, the Hungarians in Slovakia. There is a country called Slovakia, 10% of the population are Hungarians, ethnic, cultural Hungarians. They are not immigrants, the borders changed. And of course, so for them, The Slovakian state expresses a Slovakian national identity, the Hungarians have another. But they, of course, have to be treated as equal citizens.
But where this issue gets challenged is when it comes to the law of return. The argument is made that it's one thing to say, okay, I'm a multinational state which respects the different original national identities of my population. And I'm not trying to amalgamate them in some melting pot into some new national identity. The people here don't want it. It doesn't reflect the vast majority of democracies of the world where nation states belong to a particular national community, or which serve as its majority.
You have the French model in which everybody is French, of course.
But
that means that minorities in France, of course, minorities in France have much less cultural rights than Israel.
They have none. So that would be the reverse. Now, the reverse would be that's where you have to wipe out your prior culture. But where you get challenged is on the issue of the right of return. Here it is. We have one state which recognizes that there are two national identities within the confines of this state. The state, however, says that there is a preferential immigration policy towards the majority, Jews. The right of return allows anybody who's a Jew or anybody who was persecuted for being a Jew an automatic right to come here, while the Arab minority of the state of Israel doesn't have a similar right to
bring their people,
even very often to bring their family members, not even their people, even family members, unification of family members, etc. So the preserving of these two distinct national identities is creating a core discrimination against the minority. And does that discrimination, does Israel's law of return fundamentally violate the democratic aspirations of both the State of Israel and of democracy in general?
It's a controversial point, but I think it doesn't. Among other things, because there is these things are defined by International Convention on the Prevention of all forms of racism, and it's a very detailed document that really tries to remove all possible pretexts for discrimination. But it does say that it does not apply to laws of immigration and naturalization.
Does not. Why?
Does not apply to laws, because what it says is that you cannot discriminate between citizens of your country according to ethnicity, identity, religion, or anything, but you can, among all the peoples on earth, you can say there is one category of people with whom I regard myself as connected. Between non-citizens, you are allowed to discriminate in favor of your ethnic, cultural, national diaspora. This is the international law, and this is a practice of many, actually, modern states. This is not, well, the most famous one is Germany, but you say Germany, we shouldn't compare ourselves to Germany, but it's also Greece, it's Finland. You know, Finland has an ethnic diaspora in former Russia, and so it gives them a privileged access to Finnish citizenship. So you have this because borders between states are not identical with borders between identities for both immigration and changing of borders. It is a practice of many states to regard a group of people outside their boundaries as connected with them in some way, and then one of these ways of expressing is giving them privileged treatment on immigration.
So what we're discriminating is between
non-citizens and non-citizens.
In other words, we're discriminating between the non-citizens who are Jews and the non-citizens who are Palestinians, but we're not discriminating here.
The Greek Republic.
Is that a fine, is that a Talmudic argument when in fact a minority cannot bring their grandparents to the State of Israel?
Well, family unification is a difficult issue because of the conflict. Actually, Israel accepted a large number of people despite the conflict, a large number of people in the framework of family reunification, which is not a trivial thing. India doesn't do that with people who went to Pakistan. But as a matter of principle, the law of return does not apply. It doesn't give a rights to Jews in Israel, because you can come to Israel even if you don't have relatives. Every Jew has a right to come to Israel.
It goes back to your point that a Jewish democratic state means that this is the democratic state of the Jewish people.
The UN report on the partition of Palestine says that the freedom of Jewish immigration is one of the main reasons why Jews and Arabs cannot have a common state, and so they assume that there will be The Jewish state will be open to Jewish immigration. They even say they give the Jews a larger part of the country in order to enable them to bring Jews to. That was one of the reasons why the state was established. And 1 second, I have to tell you that if and when, as there should be, there is a two-state solution, of course, the Palestinian state will regard itself as connected with the Palestinian diaspora, will be open, will have its own law of return, and then think about a Jewish minority in such a state. It will not have a right to bring Jews to Palestine, but the Palestinian state will have a right to bring Palestinians to Palestine. Now, will you then regard it as an act of discrimination? No, I think two states for two peoples means also two laws of return, and the fundamental inequality between Jews and Arabs, as it exists now, will be corrected not by removing this right from the Jewish people, but by giving it right to the Palestinian people.
Very often, when Jews get worried about the future of the state of Israel, they're worried about lots of things. But one of them is the demographic challenge. Demography. Leaving aside the West Bank, they still speak about the demographic time bomb. Now, what happens when a majority speaks about a minority as a problem? That if Arabs grow, then we have a problem. There's almost a zero-sum game being played here. If a majority has a right to define the public sphere, as you said beforehand, do we also have a right to ensure that we maintain our majority status? And are there limits to what we can do in order to do that? Because that's a very alienating process for those who are in the minority, to see them, you're a problem.
Well, you're certainly right. But the demographic problem, the way in which it's being addressed in Israel, is basically the problem regarding the West Bank and Gaza, because if Israel continues to control these areas, the Jews will become a minority. The issue in Israel, with Israeli Arabs, is not really that. The issue is not a demographic issue. The issue is how do we deal with a minority, which about 20% may go up, may go down, but it is in those more or less in those confines.
And it will never be. In the foreseeable future, we're not talking about a majority.
No, but the question is, how do we integrate them? And we haven't done enough. I think Israel has, for reasons which have not to do with conscious policies, but have to do with priorities under stress. Israel, in the 1950s and 60s, when it absorbed hundreds of thousands of immigrants, built public housing for immigrants. Because if the country would not build public housing and affordable housing, really housing for which people didn't have to pay even a penny, people would be living in tents or wouldn't have where to live. It didn't build public housing in Arab areas. And this was a mistake. And this has not always been overcome. Arab schools are, until this very day, underfunded compared to majority Jewish schools. But even within the Jewish sector, there is a difference of funding in rich areas and poor areas because of municipal taxes, etc. So the issue is not a demographic issue in Israel. The issue is how do you create solidarity on both sides. And here, and I don't want to say it in a critical way, but it's a matter of fact, that some of the expressions of some of the elected Israeli Arab members of the Knesset, which view Israel as an illegitimate state, is not really, some of those expressions are not really helping in an attempt where both sides have to live with tensions, have to live with contradictions, and have to live with a lot of empathy to the other.
A Jewish democratic state is not necessarily a contradiction in terms, but it's a challenge. You can have a Jewish and democratic state, but it's going to require of us to think very seriously about how we look at our minorities, how we look at our responsibilities to democracy, and how do we look at the same time at the rights of the majority. A democracy is the rule of the majority, but which takes into account the inalienable rights of that minority. The challenge that Israel faces is how do we build that democracy in the midst of a messy political reality? How do we not enable our failures in fact to become failures in principle? And how do we ensure that Jewish democratic does not become something that we anoint ourselves with, but it becomes a responsibility that we have to fulfill?